Hey, today I will be talking about Billabong's Luck. Here's my copy, the 1970s edition. It was published in 1933, so it contains the race, class and gender themes that you would expect from a novel that was printed in 1933. So that's my warning. What happens? Okay, the book begins with a really interesting prologue where which is purporting to be the Lintons talking about the author and promising her and allowing her to write about their continuing adventures. And what is happening is that the Raynhams are struggling. It's the Great Depression. It's 1933, which is like the depths of the Depression. They've got a mortgage. Tommy even sells her little car so that they can, keep going. Jim's really annoyed about this because he keeps proposing to Tommy and she keeps turning him down because she can't leave Bob when things are so difficult. And meanwhile, we go back to Billabong and we're introduced to a new character who is little Davy, which is the Nora and Wally's son, named after David Linton, Mr. Linton. And so Davy Linton, he's about 18 months old and he's actually very sweet. I like him, and it's a wise choice to introduce him when he's a toddler and has a bit of personality rather than just as a baby. Bill turns up at Billabong, and then Bill, Bob, Jim and Wally all go exploring up in the hills that are nearby. And while they're there, Bob falls in a hole and Bill pulls him out, and then it turns out that the hole had gold in it. There is gold in them thar hills. So isn't that lucky in the middle of the Depression that they find this massive source of money? They set up a claim. They call it the Hope. Lots of the Billabong stockmen also set up little claims, but they agree they never really want to leave Billabong. Dave Boone, one of the stockmen, says he would be like a motherless calf if he ever left. They're all camping up there, working the mine. One night, and they sleep in a cave. Bill sleepwalks one night, and Tommy follows him and finds him in the caves. And then Jim comes and finds them, and he and Tommy vow that they'll never be separated anymore, because now that there's some money, Tommy feels like she can leave Bob, so she's able to marry Jim. So isn't that providential all round? I bet everybody reading it in 1933 thought, I wish I could find a gold mine. That would solve my problems too. Rescues. Right. Tommy sells her little car to help pay the rates. Bill pulls Bob out of a literal hole in the ground. It's also a metaphor because there was money in the hole. They find a wounded prospector up in the hills, and they take him back to Gunji and get him nursed, although they don't tell him that they've found gold. Jim kills a snake that's threatening Bob, and Tommy finds Bill when he's wandered off while he was sleepwalking. Sorry, I think it was a real mistake to have a place called Billabong, characters called Bob, Billy, and Bill. I find that a bit of a tongue twister. And I guess now there's also David Linton and Davy Meadows. Time passes at Billabong at a different rate to the rest of the world. So, for instance, Billy, the stock worker, who's only 2 years older than Jim in the first novel, now has threads of grey in his hair, but Jim definitely doesn't. He's still very young. He's young and active, and he's certainly, and they keep saying then they never grow up. Definitely whatever date it is in Billabong, it's not the same date that the publication date is, because it's definitely not 1933. And I'm also impressed at the way that Bruce decided to just sort of skip over the whole pregnancy and childbirth and just arrive with, and here's Davy, here's a new character, he's 18 months old and he can already talk. And by the way, he has an endearing little voice, which is, uses all of her fondness for writing dialect, because he's influenced by all of his friends who are, Billy the stockworker and Murty the Irish stockworker and Lee Wing, and so he's got an interesting little accent. So time passes differently, and pregnancies also appear to work differently at Billabong to in the real world. And that's fine. Thought I might just talk briefly about what was happening in Bruce's life. I think this novel must have been written in the UK, because she was born in Australia, but she went to the UK, the United Kingdom, in 1913 when she met her husband. Then they returned to Australia with the intention of living there, but of course the war broke out and he was summoned to join back up with his regiment. So then they were in Ireland and England and Wales during the war. They returned to Australia in 1919 and then went back to Ireland in 1927. And then they moved from Ireland to England after the death of her son Paddy. Then in 1939 she came back to Australia with her remaining son John and her husband. In 1949 her husband died and she went back on holiday to England in 1950, and then she died and then back to Australia, then 54 back to London for the Wardlock celebrations of their centenary, and she died in the UK in 1958. So she spent a lot of time in the UK. Even though she's like the quintessentially Australian author, she in fact wrote a lot of these novels while she was not in Australia. And I would just make a few comments about her success. In 1939, when she came back, there was a civic dinner in Melbourne and she was the guest of honour. There were magazine and radio interviews, and she was called the most beloved of all Australian writers, no matter what their field. And then when she went back to the UK in 1954 for the Wardlock centenary celebrations, she was the senior author. So Wardlock had her as their primo author. When she died, there are obituaries in both English and Australian papers. The Melbourne Herald said, "This is the loss of a friend for thousands of Australians." Even the Times praised her quality of mind and imagination, her warm sympathy and humanity. And her sales were enormous. The exact figures are not were lost because Wardlock were bombed in the war, but her son recalled that they got royalties of about £300 every 6 months by the late 1930s. And her biographer Alison Alexander estimates that she sold 3 million by the late 1970s. And she was sufficiently popular that she managed to make hundreds of pounds for the Red Cross during World War II just by selling her signature at sixpence per signature. She was like almost an institution, I'd say, of as an author, and the Billabong books in particular were enormously popular. They sold at least a third more than her non-Billabong books, which is why she continued to produce them throughout her career. And nowadays she probably has not much profile in literature, but in terms of absolute sales in the 1930s, she would certainly have been one of the best selling Australian authors. And I guess there's always this bias against children's literature where it doesn't really count as literature and people aren't willing to think about it. Right. In the prologue to this book, she talks about, well, I'll read the quote to you. It's really interesting. On a winter night, I fell asleep thinking of a book I was planning to write, a story which had no connection to Billabong. I awoke in grey morning light, and through the open windows I could see leafless trees. The clock in the hall chimed 7 slowly, and I tried to catch anew the idea that had been in my mind when I went to sleep the night before. And then, suddenly, I was in a large room which I knew to be the smoking room at Billabong. David Linton was there with Nora and Wally and Jim. There was nothing dreamlike about them. They were very solid and natural. They were talking quietly, and they seemed rather amused. I hear she wants to write another book, said Jim. Not about us, I hope, said Wally quickly. I don't much like all this publicity. Nora looked thoughtful. Well, we have to remember that after all she made us. She did, agreed her father. She took a lot of trouble over us too. And she gave us a very good time, Nora said. Think of all the fun we've had. Well, yes, Wally admitted. We would never have done any of these things, but for her, travel and war and all sorts of larks. And we've met such jolly people, said Jim. After all, we do owe her something, don't we? What I like, said Nora, is all the friends we've made. Such a lot of people seem to know us. It's nice to think of all the homes where we're welcome. That's fascinating. In Adventurers, she has a pretense that the Lintons are real, and this one she does make it clear that this is a vision of them, and that they're not real, but they are intruding into reality. And I guess you'd have to call them semi-real, and it's a fascinating conceit. I would really like to know if that's actually a vision, a dream that she did have, or if she's merely writing that. I read a biography of Enid Blyton, and she talked about how she wrote, and she used to close her eyes, visualize the children that she was going to write about, and then she just transcribed their adventures as they came to her, as if she was watching them on a movie screen, and that's she attributed her great prolific output to that, and in this case it sounds similar, but maybe it's just a literary fiction that Bruce is putting forward. Anyway, it's interesting. It's something to think about. So, Bruce, I think, was massively popular and acknowledged in her day, and she is now overlooked. I suppose that is often the case for children's authors in particular. They fall out of favour, and they're not regarded as being, serious literature, so they're not written about terribly much. But I continue to enjoy these stories. They're frolicking good adventures, and this one, you can see here the red-headed Bob manages to it's the whole Billabong thing. The red-headed Bill manages to pull everyone out of a literal and metaphorical hole by finding gold in the bottom of the pit. So that's a happy ending for everyone.